I still remember the sound before I saw anything. Chainsaws, multiple of them, echoing hard through the hollows like somebody was tearing the mountain apart one bite at a time. At first I just stood there on my back porch with my coffee halfway to my mouth thinking maybe somebody farther down the ridge was cutting firewood early. But then I heard the heavy engine noise behind it, equipment, diesel, metal clanking against metal, and my stomach dropped before my mind even caught up. I knew that sound. I'd spent too many years walking those woods not to know exactly what a full logging operation sounded like. And I knew one more thing. Nobody had permission to be cutting on my land. My name's Caleb Mercer, and I own 63 acres tucked into the hills outside Pine Hollow, Tennessee. It's the kind of land most people drive past and barely notice. But to me it's been part of my life for over a decade. Mixed hardwood forest, oak and walnut mostly, some black cherry in the lower draws where the ground stays richer and wetter. Every acre of it mattered to me, not just because it was valuable, though it was, but because I'd put years into taking care of it. Walking lines, thinning brush, keeping invasive vines off the younger stands, meeting with a consulting forester every couple seasons. I knew where every marker pin sat and where every orange blaze had been painted. And I was patient. That's what good timber takes. Patience. You don't rush trees. You let them grow, let them mature, let time do the heavy lifting. I had a selective harvest plan mapped out for another 4 years. By then some of those walnut trees would have hit peak value. It wasn't guesswork either. My forester had gone over every section with me and put hard numbers on paper. So when I heard chainsaws roaring from the West Ridge, I didn't think maybe. I knew. I grabbed my truck keys and headed up the gravel-cut road faster than I should have. My tires kicked dust halfway to the tree line. Then I got out and hiked the last quarter-mile uphill because trucks don't belong everywhere and neither do excuses. And what I saw when I came over that rise, man, it felt like somebody punched me square in the chest. A logging crew had half my hillside turned into a work zone. A skidder was dragging a walnut trunk bigger around than a whiskey barrel. Fresh stumps everywhere. Branches piled. Sawdust flying. And trees, my trees, crashing one after another. I just stood there for maybe 2 seconds frozen solid before anger finally got to me. I yelled over the noise, "Hey, shut that down." A couple guys looked over. One of them killed his saw, then another. The machine kept idling. A broad-shouldered guy in a hard hat stepped toward me and said, "You Caleb?" I said, "Yeah." "And whose bright idea was this?" He looked genuinely confused. "Mr. Rollins hired us." That name hit me immediately. Gavin Rollins. My new neighbor. He and his wife Natalie had bought the adjoining property 6 weeks earlier. They came in from Nashville, paid cash, talked big about land investment opportunities and unlocking the timber potential of Appalachia, like they were pitching a boardroom and not standing in muddy boots on a mountain ridge. I'd met Gavin once, maybe twice. The first time I was checking the Western Line, and he came hiking over smiling like we were old friends. Tall guy, clean boots, way too much confidence. He shook my hand and said they'd fallen in love with the mountain, said they wanted to build a retreat cabin. Then before we'd even finished talking he asked what species I had and whether walnut was bringing premium prices. That caught my attention. I remember smiling and saying, "Depends how patient you are." He laughed. Then I pointed directly toward the orange blaze marks and told him clear as day, "Everything west of this line is mine. Survey pins every 100 feet. I've got maps if you ever need them." He nodded and said, "Good to know. I respect people who manage land right." At the time I believed him, which in hindsight probably makes me the fool in this story for about 5 minutes. Back on that ridge, I walked straight past the crew boss and looked downhill. 30 feet over the line. Easy, maybe more in places. I could see my orange marks standing there plain as daylight. And right beside them, fresh stumps. I turned around and said, "You crossed the boundary." The foreman frowned. "Gavin flagged this whole section." I pointed. "No, he didn't. That line's painted." He followed my finger, and I watched realization hit his face. And right then a pickup truck came grinding up the access trail. Black Ford. Gavin behind the wheel. He stepped out irritated before he even shut the door. "What's going on?" I looked him dead in the eye. "You're cutting my timber." He gave me this half smile like I was overreacting. Then he unfolded a wrinkled, hand-drawn property sketch from his back pocket. "My consultant said this was ours." I stared at the paper, then back at him. "Your consultant needs glasses." He shrugged. "We're already into the job." I could feel heat crawling up my neck. Then stop. He glanced at the crew. Then back at me. We can sort it out later. I said, slow and very clear. No, you stop now. And Gavin actually smirked. Not joking. Not nervous. Smirked. Like I was being inconvenient. Like this was a misunderstanding he could wave off. Then he said the one sentence I'll probably remember the rest of my life. Caleb, it's just timber. For a second I didn't say anything. I just looked past him at 100-year-old walnut laid flat in the dirt. That tree had survived storms, droughts, lightning strikes, and this man had dropped it before lunch because he wanted a quicker return on investment. I pulled my phone out and said, "You've got one chance." He folded his arms. "Call whoever you want." So I did, and while that phone rang, while deputies started heading our way, while the chainsaws sat silent and diesel engines idled on my ridge, I looked across that torn-up hillside and realized this wasn't about a property line anymore. This was pride, money, and a man who thought mountains were just numbers on paper. What neither of us knew yet was exactly how expensive that attitude was about to become. The sheriff's deputy made it up the ridge about 20 minutes later, and those 20 minutes felt longer than some whole years I've lived through. Nobody was cutting anymore. The saws sat quiet. Diesel engines rattled in place. The crew stayed close to their equipment, not saying much, and Gavin kept pacing with his hands on his hips like somehow he was the one being inconvenienced. I stood by the paint-marked line trying to calm down enough to think straight, but every time I looked at another fresh stump, I felt my jaw tighten all over again. Deputy Earl Maddox finally pulled in on his side-by-side, climbed off, took one look around, and said, "Well, somebody's had themselves a busy morning." Earl had known me a long time. Grew up one ridge over. Good man, calm voice, never in a hurry unless he needed to be. Gavin walked straight over to him holding that folded sketch like it was a legal document carved into stone. "Officer, this is a property dispute." Earl looked at him and nodded. "Might be. Let's see." We walked the line together. Orange blazes. Iron pins. Survey marker at the bend. Then another. Earl crouched at one pin, brushed dirt off with his glove, stood up and looked straight at Gavin. "Boundary looks pretty clear to me." Gavin immediately got defensive. "My consultant told me different." Earl said. "Then your consultant ought to come explain himself." That shut things down fast. He ordered the crew off the hillside until ownership could be verified, and they packed up without much eye contact. I'll give the foreman credit. Before he left, he walked over quiet and said, "Mr. Mercer, I wouldn't have crossed if I'd known." I believed him. He was hired labor. Gavin was the one who'd pointed. And once the machines rolled away and the mountain finally got quiet again, that silence hurt worse than the noise. I walked downhill through broken limbs and churned mud counting stumps one by one. 46, 47, and there might as well have been 47 punches landing with every step. Some of those trunks had taken decades to get there. A few were the kind my grandfather would have stopped and admired. I called my attorney before I even got back to the truck. His name was Daniel Pierce out of Knoxville. I'd met him years earlier through a forestry management seminar and remembered one thing immediately. If timber trespass landed on his desk, somebody usually regretted it. He answered on the second ring. I told him what happened. He listened all the way through, then said, "Take pictures of everything. Don't move a thing. I'm driving out tomorrow." The next morning Daniel showed up with a legal pad, boots, and an expression that told me Gavin Rollins had chosen exactly the wrong person to test. He also brought a forestry valuation expert named Wade Harmon. Wade looked like a retired linebacker and talked like a math professor. He measured stump diameters, estimated board footage, checked growth rings, photographed equipment tracks, and marked coordinates. By late afternoon, he stood beside his truck flipping through notes and whistled low. "That's not a cheap mistake." Daniel looked at him. "How bad?" Wade said, "Standing value, 48,000 easy. Maybe more depending on the walnut market." Daniel looked at me and gave a small nod. "Kentucky line or not, Tennessee law treats willful timber trespass seriously too, especially with marked boundaries. This gets expensive." 2 days later, Gavin got a formal demand letter. Full compensation, restoration damages, and legal notice. Daniel made sure every page was crystal clear. Gavin had 10 business days to resolve it before we filed. He answered through his attorney on day 9. Offer amount, $6,000. I laughed when Daniel read it to me. Not because it was funny, Because sometimes disrespect gets so obvious all you can do is laugh. Their letter claimed boundary confusion, conflicting advice, misunderstanding of terrain, all the usual polished nonsense. They also suggested good neighbor compromise. Daniel folded the paper and said, "Want my opinion?" I said, "Please." He smiled. "Let's introduce them to court." So we filed. And the second papers were served. Gavin changed tone fast. Suddenly, he wasn't friendly mountain investor anymore. He became angry, defensive, started telling neighbors I was trying to bankrupt him, claimed I'd exaggerated the damage, claimed I was impossible to work with, claimed the orange paint was old and hard to see, which was impressive considering you could spot it from half the ridge away. One afternoon, I ran into Natalie Rollins at the hardware store. She looked tired, really tired. She gave me one awkward little nod near the checkout and said quietly, "Gavin says this is getting blown out of proportion." I looked at her and kept my voice calm. "Natalie, he cut 47 trees off my land after I warned him to stop." She looked down at the floor, didn't answer, and for a second I almost felt bad for her because she looked like somebody watching a train she couldn't stop. Then I remembered the hillside. A week later, Daniel called and said, "You're gonna like this." Gavin had already lined up a timber buyer to sell the logs he cut. Daniel filed for emergency injunction before the transfer closed. Judge granted it. The logs were frozen. Couldn't sell them. Couldn't move them. Couldn't process them. They sat stacked in Gavin's lower yard under open sky while paperwork dragged forward. Summer rain came. Then more heat. Bark dried. Ends cracked. Walnut darkened. Oak grayed out. Every week, they sat there losing value. Every time I drove past, I'd see Gavin standing beside those piles with his arms crossed, looking mad enough to chew nails. We had depositions in August. That was where things started cracking. Gavin repeated his story under oath. Consultant gave bad directions, believed he owned the section, acted in good faith. Then Daniel slid photos across the table. Orange paint visible. Marker pins visible. Equipment tracks crossing directly over them. Then Daniel asked one question. "Mr. Rollins, did Caleb Mercer tell you 6 weeks before logging exactly where the boundary sat?" Gavin hesitated. He mentioned a line. Daniel leaned back. "A line with survey pins?" Gavin paused longer. "Possibly," Daniel said. "And on the day of cutting, did he demand you stop immediately?" Gavin's attorney objected. Daniel smiled. Deputy Maddox already confirmed it. Gavin looked furious. His jaw flexed, and he finally muttered, "Yes." Daniel closed his notebook. No further questions. That was the moment I knew this had shifted. He wasn't defending confusion anymore. He was trying to survive consequences. Court got scheduled for late October. The leaves had started turning red across the ridges by then. Funny thing about mountain timber. Even after somebody tears part of it down, the rest still stands there beautiful, like nature refuses to care about human ego. Morning of trial, I parked outside county courthouse with coffee in hand and looked across the lot. Gavin climbed out of his truck wearing a pressed jacket and expensive boots that still somehow looked brand new. He caught my eye, walked over. For a second I thought maybe he'd finally come to settle. Instead, he stopped a few feet away and said, "You really taking this all the way?" I said, "You really asking me that after what you did?" He shook his head. "You could have worked this out." I looked at him and almost laughed. "Gavin, I tried. On the ridge. Before another tree hit the ground." He stared at me hard for a second, then said, "You're making this personal." I said, "No. You made it expensive." Then I walked inside. And once court started, once testimony lined up, photos came out, experts took the stand, and every marker pin got documented on record, the story Gavin had been telling everybody back in town started falling apart piece by piece. But the real turning point came when Judge Barrett leaned forward from the bench, looked directly at Gavin Rollins, and asked him one simple question that changed the whole room. Judge Barrett had been quiet most of the morning, which somehow made everybody pay closer attention whenever he moved. He was one of those men who didn't waste words. Silver hair, sharp eyes, born and raised in eastern Tennessee, the kind of judge who understood exactly what land means in places like ours. Not as numbers on paper, not as investments or tax write-offs, but as something tied to families, time, memory, and work. He leaned forward, folded his hands on the bench, and looked right at Gavin. The whole courtroom got still enough you could hear somebody shifting papers in the back row. Then the judge asked, "Mr. Rollins, when Mr. Mercer told you to stop cutting, Why didn't you stop? Gavin blinked. For the first time all day, he didn't have an answer ready. His lawyer adjusted his tie. Gavin cleared his throat and said, I believe the timber was mine. Judge Barrett nodded once. Even with visible markers? Gavin hesitated. My consultant had indicated the judge cut him off. That wasn't my question. Another pause. Longer this time. Gavin looked at the defense table, then finally said, We were already into the job. Judge Barrett tilted his head a little. So your position is, because work had already started, you continued despite being warned? Gavin swallowed. I thought we could resolve it afterward. And there it was. Plain and clean, and sitting right in the middle of the courtroom where nobody could dress it up anymore. Daniel barely had to say another word. The independent forestry expert testified. Deputy Maddox confirmed the markers. Wade broke down the timber value stump by stump with charts and measurements. Then photos came up on the courtroom screen. Bright orange boundary paint on standing trees and skid tracks crossing directly over them. Gavin's hand-drawn map looked even worse next to certified surveys. You could feel the room changing. That confidence he'd walked in with was gone. Natalie sat beside him staring straight ahead with both hands folded tight in her lap. And me? I just sat there listening to every detail, every number, every witness, thinking about that morning on the ridge and trying not to picture walnut trunks hitting dirt. By mid-afternoon, Judge Barrett called a recess. We all stepped outside. The air had that October bite to it, and leaves were blowing across the courthouse steps. Daniel stood beside me sipping coffee and said, He handed us intent himself. I asked, that enough? Daniel gave me a sideways look. Caleb. He admitted he knew there was a dispute and kept cutting anyway. That matters. 20 minutes later, we were back inside. The judge reviewed notes for what felt like forever. Then he set his glasses down and started reading. The ruling was direct. The plaintiff had established ownership clearly. The property boundary had been visibly marked. The defendant had proceeded with commercial timber removal despite direct notice and warning. The trespass was determined willful. Damages awarded based on expert valuation, $48,000. Then enhanced damages for willful conduct under state law, $144,000 total, plus attorney fees, plus court costs. Payment due within 60 days. You could feel the air leave Gavin's body from 6 feet away. His attorney stood and respectfully asked the court to consider structured payment over time. Judge Barrett looked at him and said, The defendant had time to stop. He chose not to. Motion denied. Gavel down. Case over. And just like that, months of anger turned into one quiet, strange feeling I still have trouble describing. Relief, sure. Satisfaction too. But also sadness. Because winning money doesn't make a hillside look the same again. Outside the courthouse, Gavin caught up with me near the steps. His face had gone pale, and there was no swagger left in him anywhere. He said, low enough nobody else could hear, You really couldn't let this go. I turned toward him. You still don't get it. He stared at me. I pointed toward the hills beyond town. You cut land I spent years protecting, and you smiled when I asked you to stop. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Then Natalie stepped beside him and quietly touched his arm. Not dramatic, not angry, just tired. They walked away without another word. He appealed. Of course he did. Delayed everything another few months. But the appellate court upheld every dollar. Nothing changed. By spring, he had refinanced his house in Franklin to cover judgment and fees. Word got around pretty fast. Small towns always talk. Some folks thought he got exactly what he deserved. A few said maybe the penalty was too harsh. One old-timer at the feed store laughed and said, Mountain taught him math the hard way. And maybe that was true. The logs he'd cut stayed stacked in his lower yard all winter long because injunction paperwork kept them frozen. Rain, snow, freezing nights. By the time release finally came, the value had dropped hard. Cracks everywhere. Color gone. Moisture damage. I hired a salvage mill to haul what was left. Got back maybe $4,000 from timber that should have been worth 12 times that standing in the woods. A month later, I walked the ridge by myself just before sunset. The ground was greening back up. Birds were moving through the upper canopy. Wind through leaves sounded normal again, but those stumps were still there. Fresh growth would come eventually. Saplings already pushing through in spots. Nature always starts over whether we deserve it or not. I stood beside the biggest walnut stump and ran my hand across the cut rings. More than a century of growth in that tree, and gone because one man figured profit mattered more than patience. That part stuck with me. Some people see land and only think about what they can take from it right now. Board feet, price per acre, fast return. But when you actually live with a mountain long enough, you start understanding something different. You protect what you can because not everything valuable is supposed to be rushed. Gavin never really understood that. Maybe he still doesn't. Last I heard they listed that property and dropped the asking price twice. Maybe somebody else will buy it and treat it better. Maybe not. But every time I walk that western line now, I still check the orange blazes, still touch the survey pins. Still pause where the hillside opens up, and I remember exactly how quickly a man can mistake confidence for ownership. So I'll leave it to you. If somebody ignores a clearly marked boundary, keeps cutting after being warned, then ends up owing every dime the court can throw at him, is that justice? Or is that revenge wearing work boots? Let me know down in the comments because around here folks still argue both sides of it. And if you enjoy real stories about land disputes, rural justice, and neighbors learning expensive lessons they probably should have learned sooner, hit like, subscribe, and stick around, because trust me, out here there's always another ridge, and somebody always thinks the line doesn't apply to them.